Welcome to Power Lunch Live. I'm Rhett Power, your host. It's good to be with you here. I can't believe it's already February. That just blows my mind. But today's Power Lunch is going to be a lot of fun. I've got Steven Kotler on today. We're going to talk about peak performance and his new book, The Art of the Impossible. Now, the point of Power Lunch Live is to have today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, people doing amazing work in the world that can help us get better at what we do. Now, it is an interactive show. So you got to ask good questions, though, smart questions that are relevant to the program. But please do that. We do monitor LinkedIn Live, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all those platforms. If you have a great question, we'll get it on the air and get it to Steven so we can maybe get to something that you want to change or improve at. So now Steven is a New York Times bestselling author. He's an award-winning journalist and founder and executive director of the Flow Research Collective. He's written 12 books, including the national bestsellers, The Future is Faster Than You Think, The Rise of Superman, Stealing Fire, Abundance, and Bold. His work has been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes and has been translated into 40 languages and has appeared in more than 100 publications, all of them that you know: New York Times, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Wired, Time. We're here to talk about his new book, The Art of Impossible. Steven, welcome.
Good to be with you, Rhett.
Yeah, thank you. So how has the pandemic changed you, or has it changed you at all?
It has changed me very little. It has, where it had a profound impact, it moved the Flow Research Collective, the training portion went from sort of live, sort of digital, and which was blending, to completely digital, which turned out to be fantastic for us. Not just, it was fantastic for our clients. It was all on me. Like, there was shit I was really resistant to. No, it's super good live, and then when it finally, and I won't do it digital, it'll ruin the experience. Yeah, okay, that was all ego. It turns out it was so much better digital and so much better for our customers. It also, we had a full research slate because we do a lot of work. We do a lot of neurobiology, and for example, we had a 4-part study on the neuroscience of gratitude and flow that we were in the middle of with USC and Glenn Fox, a neuroscientist at USC. That is just, it got shut down. A couple other things like that just a research project that just absolutely got stalled. And the flip side is, our company exploded because peak performance was on people's minds a little bit in general, but COVID put it just right at the forefront. And, turns out we have, if you're dealing with things like hypervigilance and crazy anxiety, and you're trying to perform your best under those conditions, that's sort of the work we do. So we were well suited to be of use. And so the company exploded as a result. My staff tripled over the course of COVID, among other things.
Well, I think you're right. Everybody's dealing with, and we're going to get to kind of the workplace part of, your work and the book and all that, because, you're right. People's work and world kind of went upside down, right? And so how are you going to get peak performance out of people sitting at home? And how do you onboard those people? How do you train those people? How do you motivate those people? But I want to ask you about flow first. You were talking about your journey before we came on, about your journey writing this book, but what is flow, and why have you devoted your work and kind of your life to helping people reach that or get that peak performance, I guess, is the question.
Flow is scientifically defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. That doesn't get us very far, but more specifically, it refers to any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand, what you're doing, everything else just seems to disappear. Action and awareness start to merge. Your sense of self-consciousness gets very, very quiet. Time dilates, which means it passes strangely. It'll slow down on occasion. You'll get a freeze frame effect. You've been in a car crash. More frequently, it speeds up, and 5 hours will go by in like 5 minutes. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, tend to go through the roof. And I have my life most of my life has been spent, most of my adult life, my career as a journalist and as a writer has been spent trying to answer the question, what does it take to do the impossible? History is sort of littered with those moments when the impossible becomes possible. And I have really spent 30 years using the tools of neuroscience and psychology, but predominantly neuroscience, studying those moments in time when that happened. And some of it was in sport, a lot of it was in science and technology. For example, for a lot of the publications you were reading, I had a list of like 37 science fiction technologies that I was tracking. And the moment they became science fact, I was in the room or doing my very best to be in the room and trying to figure out, well, how the hell did this happen? This thing that was supposed to be impossible forever, why is it now possible? And whenever you see the impossible become possible and you talk to the people involved, you'll hear all kinds of things about what they do in their lives and their skills and whatever, and you always hear flow. You always hear people, you hear the inventors and the business leaders talk about flow and giving them immense insights and fiendish productivity and all kinds of stuff. You talk to the athletes, it was present when they were, doing their version of the 4-minute mile and so forth and so forth. It's everywhere. You see peak performance. It's not the only thing that, defines peak performance. There's other stuff going on. But because it is an optimal state of performance, it's tautological to the impossible. And I just, I came in through this question of what does it take to do that? And, flow was a big part of the answer. It wasn't the whole of the answer. There's more stuff going on. And not just physical stuff. You also see a lot of my books are about disruptive technology. And usually whenever you see the impossible become possible, what you see is people harnessing disruptive technologies, accelerating disruptive technologies, and finding ways, usually flow, to expand human capability. And when those two things come together, you tend to see something that's never happened before happen.
That begs a lot of questions, but what's the most surprising thing that you've learned? And we're going to get back to the book and the work in a second, but I'm just fascinated by these topics. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned in all your research and interviews with the top athletes and the top performers in the world? What's the most surprising thing that you've learned from them?
I think it's less from them than about them. And to put it in, it's easier to sort of define by story. I started out in action sports, covering action sports as a journalist. And the 1990s, which is when I started my career, is known as the era of impossible, where more so-called impossible feats than ever before in history were done. And they were iterated upon again and again and again. And that in and of itself was amazing. But the view on the inside was very peculiar, because if you knew these athletes and spent any time with them, most of the people I knew came from difficult childhoods and broken homes. They had very little education. They had very little money. There was a lot of risk taking, a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol. Normally, when you put those things together in a community, you get death, you get jail, you don't get reinventing what's possible for the human species. And yet, again and again and again, in every domain where I saw this was always the case. To put it similarly, the way I say it is, in 30 years of peak performance, the craziest thing I've learned is that we are all hardwired for the extraordinary. I spent my career studying people who have done extraordinary things in the world, and none of them started out extraordinary. They all start out just like you and me. And in fact, most of them are so much more broken than you would ever comprehend. There's this idea now, you hear it a lot in peak performance and psychology and other people, where people are like, oh, I'm really broken. I got to fix what's wrong with me before I can start to excel. That's, so what was most surprising is that's never the case. The way I simply put it is, every super successful person I've ever met is running from something just as fast as they're running towards something, because it's hard to get someplace worth going. And having that double motivation is very, very, very useful. And so I think that's one of the, we're all capable of so much more than we know. We're all hardwired for extraordinary. The flip side is that none of these people start out extraordinary. They start out like me and you, and they're just as broken and just as messed up in the head and the heart and the soul and everything else. And it's just as confusing. and for them here as it is for you. You know what I mean? Like there's no secret, and there's no exception to those rules as far as I can tell.
And they're not Superman, right? I mean, that was for me what I'm glad you went there, because that for me was really one of the bigger takeaways from your work and from this book, and is that, I mean, that hardwire that you can actually harness this, right? If you do it right, that you can harness this, I don't want to say energy, but this kind of state, and help people really maximize their performance. And it doesn't take an Olympic athlete or an extraordinary
at all
person, right?
At all. In fact, so just talking about flow, right? Let's back up in 1 second. Let's define peak performance, because people hear that and they think LeBron James in the finals, right? They don't think, Sarah in the office on Tuesday. But peak performance is nothing more than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. We are all hardwired for peak performance. The human brain is hardwired for it. And to put it in really basic terms, this is not entirely what I mean, but one of the most, flow is the source code of peak performance, and flow is universal in humans. In fact, most mammals can get into flow. And there's cross speed. So there's group flow. When you get into flow with a group of people, great brainstorming session where ideas are flying off the wall. That's group flow. But there's cross species flow. So horse and rider flow. Dogs get into flow states. You can get in flow states with dogs. This is stuff I wrote a little bit about in my book, A Small Furry Prayer, like 10 books ago. I talked about some of these ideas. But flow is conserved in mammals. It's how mammals do peak performance, and it's universal. So anyone, anywhere can get into flow, provided certain initial conditions are met. And to put a really fine point on it, at the Flow Research Collective, my organization, as I said, we're a research and training organization. And on the training side, we train everybody. We train about 1,000 people a month, and we train everybody from kind of U.S. Special Forces, members of the U.S. Special Forces and Olympic and professional athletes, through a lot of, C-suite executives, through, insurance brokers from Indiana, and soccer moms from Detroit, and, stay-at-home dads from Georgia, right? Like we train everybody. And the reason our trainings work for everybody is because everybody's got the same biology. Right? It's shared among everybody. And all we're doing is using your biology, teaching you how to use your biology for you rather than against you. And here's the coolest part about it. When you get it working right, you go farther faster. It doesn't necessarily make it any easier, right? Excellence is not easy. It's still difficult. I don't think it's any more difficult than anything else. One of the things that's interesting about emotions is if you've sort of made it through your teenage years, you've already felt the worst that life can offer because of how emotional set points work and hormones as teenagers. Like, I'm not saying you won't feel that bad again, or it won't go on for days and days and days and days in a row, and you might not have experienced that. But literally, like, if you were tough enough to make it into a young adulthood, right, you're really tough enough to go after these high, hard challenges because it literally can't hurt anymore by biological design.
You've already got it. You've already experienced it.
That's what I'm saying. Like, you're tough enough is my point.
So how do you teach that? I mean, give us a teaser on that. If people are listening and they're saying, well, this is intriguing, but what does that mean? Right. You talk about,
I mean, like
100% more productive. What does that mean?
Okay. So, I mean, we can talk about, so by the way, when you say that 500% more productive, let's put a little context around that. It's a cool number. And what happened was McKinsey wanted to know how much more productive are top executives in flow than out of flow. And so they spent a decade asking top executives. So that 500%, it's self-reported. So you got to like a little bit of grain of salt, but they spent a decade and asked a shit ton of people. And on average, you heard 500% more productive. So that comes from, flow is often talked about as the source code of intrinsic motivation. To put it in really simple terms, when we move into flow, there are neurochemicals in the brain. These are signaling molecules. They're the way the brain talks to itself and talks to the body, right? It sends out chemical messages. These are neurochemicals. Some of those chemicals are known as reward chemicals. They reward behavior that is good for our survival, right? And flow cocktails, the 5 most potent reward chemicals the brain can produce. It's the only time we appear to get all 5 at once. And reward chemicals are internal versions of essentially street drugs. When we're talking about endorphins, you're talking about opiates, right? You're talking about Oxycontin or morphine or heroin. Except, just so we understand ourselves, there are about 20 different endorphins produced by the brain, the most common of which, it's 100 times more potent than medical morphine. So hugely powerful pleasure, pain-killing pleasure drug, and you get 4 more of these. So when you talk about flow as the source code of intrinsic motivation, think really addictive pleasure drugs in my system. That's why those top executives are 500% more productive, because the state is so fun and so pleasurable and so enjoyable, and also meaningful. Right? When we look at overall life satisfaction, well-being, meaning, and purpose, the people who score off the charts for all those things are the people with most flow in their lives. When positive psychologists define happiness, tiers of happiness and well-being, there are 3 tiers, with the amount of flow being part of tier 2 and 3. Like the best we get to feel on this planet has flow in the definition by definition. So really foundational to all this stuff. Neurobiologically, a lot of that's happening because of neurochemicals. How do you get more flow? All right, this is pretty simple. The other thing that you have to remember is peak performance is getting our biology to work for us, right? That biology was designed millions of years ago, right? So nothing is very fancy. In fact, I often say, I'll tell you how to get more flow in your life in a half a second, and I'm going to tell you what the problem most people are going to have with it is this. So one, by the way, if you want more flow in your life, if you go to www.flowblocker.com, it's a free diagnostic. At the Flow Research Collective, we built a diagnostic. There are 6 major flow blockers that people encounter. We just built a diagnostic. This one will help you, tell you which one's in front of you and how do you remove it. But that's not the point I was getting to. The point I was getting to is nothing I'm going to talk about is sexy. Like nothing I'm going to talk about. If you go to a bar on Friday night and you talk about it, it won't get you laid. It will. I guarantee it. Like it's not like that's the biggest problem with this stuff. In today's world, we want a new substance. We want a new technology. We want something whiz bang. And the difficulty with this stuff is it's really simple. And so,
you mean I can't press a button on my Apple Watch and it turns it on?
Well, you can, but it won't turn this on. It'll just turn something else on. So here's what you need to know. Flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. There are 22 that we know of, 12 that lead to individual flow, me in a flow state or you in a flow state, and there's 10 that lead to group flow, us together in a flow state. So flow follows focus. First thing you need to know, it can only show up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now. So that's what the triggers do. They drive attention in the present moment. If I were to explain it scientifically, they do it one of 3 ways. They either produce the neurochemicals dopamine and or norepinephrine. Both of these are performance-enhancing chemicals. They're pleasure chemicals, but they're focus-enhancing chemicals. So when they're in our system, we pay more attention to what's in front of us. And how do we know this? We've all experienced this because curiosity is underpinned by dopamine and norepinephrine. So when you're curious, what do you get? Focus for free. Right, that's what happens when these chemicals are in our system. Or these a third thing that some of the triggers do, and some of these triggers will do 2 or 3 of these things, but some of them will just act on one, is lower cognitive load, which is all the crap you're thinking about at any one time. So if I lower cognitive load, I liberate a bunch of energy that you can repurpose for attention on the task at hand. That's what the triggers do. So, for example, on the dopamine side, there are 5 major dopamine triggers: novelty, risk, complexity, unpredictability, and insight. When we link ideas together, connect patterns. In fact, everybody who's ever done a crossword puzzle is Sudoku. You can fill in an answer, right? That's pattern recognition. That little high you get when you fill in an answer, that's dopamine, right? And it's helping you pay attention to the thing. It's rewarding your pattern recognition. So all of those things will work as a flow trigger. So what does that look like in the real world? Simple example. Because what I do for a living, have to read a lot of neuroscience textbooks. And as you might imagine, they're thrillers. Start to finish, you pick them up, you just can't put them down. Page turners, nonstop. Anyways, my point is that they're thick, they're lugubrious, but we know that will learn about 240 to 500% faster than normal. Depends on what we're trying to learn. Also, reading flow. When you read, get into flow that way. And you can usually tell you're in flow because you're not just reading the thing in front of you, but your ideas are flying off, right? Like that's that experience. That's one of the more common flow states on earth. So okay. I want to be in reading flow if I got to read a neuroscience textbook because I'm doing it for work. And right, so what do I do? Now, I am very good at, I can pay attention under crazy circumstances. I wrote my college thesis in a bar because I live very far away from campus and I was a bartender. So I'd come in early and I would work and then I would tend bar. And so like I can handle noisier environments but I go to coffee shops far away, not during COVID, but normally. Why? Novel environments. Slightly unpredictable environments, slightly novel environments, and unpredictability produces a little bit of dopamine, and novelty produces a little bit of dopamine. And I'm reading my neuroscience, and suddenly there's a little more dopamine and a little more dopamine. And if I start connecting ideas in the textbook to older ideas I've had, that's insight, that will give me enough dopamine to start to drive me into flow. So really simple hack, but it's one I use when I have to learn difficult stuff for work and I'm not super fired up to do it, right? Like,
I mean, that's why I work better in a coffee shop. That's right. When I need to be focused, I actually get out of the office.
A lot of
it's all work for me.
Yeah, it's also you also start tuning out a lot of irrelevant stimuli more easily. Like the overdose of novelty, your brain starts to say, okay, I'm only going to show you super novel stuff because it's everywhere and you learn to focus through it. It's if you have that skill, it can be incredibly useful. I mean, and in the morning I do the exact opposite. I write in my office at 4 a.m. when it's pitch black, and complete concentration is a flow trigger. So I practice distraction management the night before. We train people to do this. Like, I'm going to start my day with my writing. It's my most important task. So I turn everything off the night before. Email goes off, messages goes off, all the social media stuff, anything, it all goes off. I open my writing and put it in a focus view. So all I get is the damn words and nothing else. My office stays black. And so I start my day with a long period of uninterrupted concentration. By the way, if you're playing with this at home, this is especially useful. The research shows if you really want to maximize flow, start your work session, your hardest work session, in alignment with your circadian rhythms, right? I'm an extreme lark. I get up naturally 3 to 4 a.m. So I start working then because that's when I naturally wake up. It's my most productive. My wife is a night owl. You wake her up at 3 o'clock in the morning, she would punch you, right? Like she wants to start working at 4 p.m. But whenever you're at your most productive in alignment with your basic circadian rhythms, start your session with a 90-minute block of uninterrupted concentration for your hardest, most important task. The thing that if you complete it, right, biggest win for the day. 90 minutes is the human brain evolved to focus, much in the same way that REM sleep is 90 minutes long. Right? Mm-hmm. We have a waking focus cycle that's 90 to 110 minutes. This is also, by the way, why Montessori education is built around 90 to 120 minute blocks of uninterrupted learning, right? This is all the same stuff because this is our biology. So, and a lot of people hear this, by the way, and they have one of three reactions. One is, oh my God, this is cool. I'm going to try this out right away. 2, managers, lawyers, people in those categories, they hear this and they're like, their answer is, fuck you, man. My day is meetings. I'm not going to spend 90 minutes, right? Like that's literally that's the response I get. And I have, and I heard them, right? So what I did is I went and I talked to couple hundred really top level managers, really. And I said, look, this is pushback I'm getting from a lot of people who have, do your job. You're doing it better than most, almost to a person. They said, look, if I'm doing my job is mostly strategy and company alignment and things like that. And I spend that 90 minutes figuring out exactly how I'm going to get the best out of every call I'm going to make during the day. And everything becomes so much more productive that way. And maybe it's not 90 minutes. The other thing that people say, especially working from home, is, fuck you, dude. I don't have 90 minutes. My kids, my wife, my husband, right? Like, fair enough. Here, two things on that. One, start by starting, right? Like, as I said when I started this thing, like, broken people did this shit, right? Like, stop. There's no perfect life that's going to happen. You start by starting. If it's 10 minutes today, great. Second thing to know, flow's 500% more productivity. So whoever wants your attention, they're actually going to get more of you, not less of you, by doing this, right? Because you're going to get through stuff faster. The most important thing with working from home, and unless you have little kids, and then, I'm sorry, and you shouldn't have had those children, and bad on you. But I always say, have your conversations ahead of time, right? Like, talk to your spouse, talk to your partner, talk to your kids, explain, hey, this is my uninterrupted concentration time. It allows me to maximize work, gives me more freedom time for you later, but you got to give me this. And when we get back to work, the companies that are very effective with this, one, they don't have open office plans. Or if they do have open office plans, if they were dumb enough to create an open office plan office, they've now put those WeWork little phone booth pods in their office to put in the offices that they couldn't have before, right? Like, I get the fact that we want to flatten the hierarchies and power dynamics with offices or whatever, and nobody wants to work in a cubicle, and I get all that stuff. But it turns out, like, the brain likes to focus, and it likes to be able to shut a door, right?
Yeah.
I like, when I talk about complete concentration, I point out that one of the things that matters, not all the time, because you and I both talked about working in coffee shops and doing certain things then, but for writing, right? Not reading, but for writing, for me, I need total complete concentration. And the reason I like early morning is non-time and no one. Not only that there's no one around who's going to interrupt me, it's that the time doesn't belong to anybody. Once it's 8 o'clock, once I know that my assistant is in, so you know what I mean? And once I know that, like, it's now the time is sort of, it belongs to my company, it belongs to me, it belongs to a whole bunch of people. It's not non-time. And the reason this matters so much, where it's really important, is creative problem solving. So I need the luxury to be able to spend sometimes 4 hours on a paragraph. It's I'm not happy about it, right? But
hey,
that's what it takes. And every work project, or I need to spend 4 hours piecing together a tiny bit of neuroscience research, that we're going to apply to in our train, blah, blah, kind of thing. And sometimes that's what it takes. And if I try to do that in the middle of the day, when it's sort of shared time, I can't focus my brain enough to do it. I need that kind of quiet, non-time, no one.
I like the way you talked about that, though, right? Because I think you can negotiate that. That's a good advice, right? You negotiate that time.
Yes, and you negotiate it really with. What's so great about the fact that we're having the flow conversation out loud at this point, and we have been for a while at a national level in business, which is great because the companies who have done the best at this organizationally, Patagonia, Microsoft, Mac and Apple, handful of other, Toyota, handful of others, they put flow-based principles sort of at the center of what they do, meaning putting employees into flow is priority one. And that's a weird, you're like, wait a minute, we make widgets. Our widgets got to be priority one. And sort of, yes, but actually employees in flow has to be priority one because you'll get way more widgets made. That way, and that's consistently what's found. So what used to be 10 years ago a very difficult discussion is now, 55% of all American companies now have mindfulness training programs. And mindfulness is one altered state that's not even actually useful in a work environment. It's useful because it gives you emotional regulation and better focus. It actually trains up the brain for flow. It's a good training for flow, but it's not. Flow's an active action state. You're problem solving. It's built for work. In fact, studies show flow is a spectrum of experiences. It's not there. It can be micro flow on one end. This is when those initial conditions of flow show up. We talked about like complete concentration, the merger of action awareness, and this is like you sit down to write a quick email at work and you get so sucked in, an hour goes by and you've written an essay and you didn't notice time passing, and maybe your sense of self-consciousness didn't disappear, but bodily awareness was gone. And when you pop back into your head, you're like, oh my God, I got to go to the bathroom, and you run for the right. Like that happens to all of us all the time. That's a low-grade flow state. It's micro flow. Macro flow is what most people think is flow. It's the full-blown mystical experience, time slowed down, and that sort of stuff. And that can happen, but micro flow is way more common. And if you can notice micro flow, you can turn it up. You drop in more flow triggers, and you start layering in more neurochemicals, and you will turn micro flow into macro flow. First of all. Second of all, we spend about 5% of our work life in micro flow without even noticing it. This is like a really well-established business fact. It's very common in work environments. Here's the cool thing. I think it was the McKinsey study that pointed this out also. I could be wrong, but somebody figured out that if we take that 5% of our work life that we spend in flow, and if we can up it by 15 percentage points to 20% of our work life in flow, globally, overall workplace productivity would double. How's that for a shocking number?
That's a return.
That's a 500% boost in productivity, right? Spread out, or just sort of averaged out over a company and blah, blah, blah. But like, could you imagine what you're talking about to the GDP?
That's insane. I mean, that's quite a return. Let me ask, so comparing that to these high performance athletes and people that you work with, what are they living? I mean, so this is great. So let's explain. We put this in context of the athletes. Like, what the hell happened to the athletes? Well, first of all, a lot of the conversation around today is stuff that's in The Art of Impossible, right? It's in the Newbook, and anybody who reads this book, if you're a top performer, right, like top 20% of whatever, you're going to find a lot of stuff that's familiar, because there's just our biology and it's a limited toolkit, right? So the book covers the full spectrum. This is all the tools, and this is the sequence and the order they're supposed to be applied in. But a lot of people get very, very far, doing a lot of this stuff naturally. It just happens on your way to kind of excellence anyways. The book sort of amplifies that. So what you see with the athletes, especially the action sport athletes in the 90s, is they built their lives around all of flow's triggers. So insight is very common in creativity, right? When we link ideas together. Yeah, until before 1990, if you wanted to be a top athlete in action sports, for example, you were the fastest man or woman to the bottom of the mountain, right? That's how we measured excellence in skiing or snowboarding, right? Suddenly, it was most creative line. It was right, and and that's insight. And so that creativity, everything became about expression sessions. In fact, the very terms we now use to describe action sports, free skier, free surfer, free rider, all that, what is that free shit about? It literally means creativity is the value, right? It means an expression session. I'm creative. So what happened was they built their lives around flow triggers, and they took certain flow triggers and made them core values among their communities. But the really important thing to point out is it's not just the action sport athletes. It's any time you see a culture of innovation. Silicon Valley today, Seattle in the grunge rock movement in the 90s, Paris in the 1920s, San Francisco in the 1960s, wherever you see a culture of innovation, you're seeing a culture packed with flow triggers. In fact, in business, the best example, and I talk about this in my book, Bold, if you go back to the skunk works, how every big company has done innovation for 100 years. Flow is a massive amplification of creativity and innovation, 400 to 700%, depending on whose numbers you're going by, for a lot of reasons I can get into. But skunk works are literally, there are 14 rules for skunk, according to Kelly Johnson, who created the first skunk works at Lockheed Martin. They are all, handful of them are about how do you work with the Army, because that was an Army project. But the 11 that remain, once you get the Army out of the picture,
are all flow triggers. They're all about establishing autonomy. Autonomy is a flow trigger. Rapid experimentation gives you rapid feedback. Feedback is a flow trigger, and on and on. They're literally flow incubators. That's how we do innovation, because that's how biologically we do innovation and creativity. We shift state, and that's what happens. So if you create the conditions to shift state, blah, blah, blah. By the way, this is Steve Jobs did this when he Pixar, right? When he I don't think they did this, but when he wanted to put the one bathroom right next to the common, so everybody would come together, because complexity and unpredictability and novelty are flow triggers. And if you get employees in the flow, creativity soars, and you win a lot of Oscars, which is exactly what happened, right? Like, he designed that space to create, or different parts of his organization would talk to one another that would not normally, right? Marketing wasn't talking to coding, wasn't talking to cell animation. And he built a space that forced it to happen. As a result, novelty, unpredictability, complexity go up, way more flow, way more Oscars.
Yeah. I mean, he understood design in every sense of the word, right? I mean, from that to product, I mean,
and lifestyle, I mean, a lot of it, lifestyle designs. I mean, why do you wear, both Steve Jobs and I favor black sweatshirts. He liked black turtlenecks. But why do you do that? Like, what's that about? That's lowering cognitive load. I'm right. I know what I'm going to be wearing at all times, no matter what, especially, right? I don't have to ever think about it. That stuff takes up space. I don't want it to take up space. I want the energy for flow. So this is it's you know what I mean? Like, that's why you wear the same thing over and over and over again. There's lots of different ways to work with. I work with a brilliant venture capitalist named Otto Kumbar. He's one of the investors in the Flow Research Collective. And Otto was at second in command at GE under Jack Welch for a long time. He goes to Costco and buys 10 of the same shirts every year, and he alternates. Right. Like, you can do this any which way you want to do, but these are literally, I mean, and maybe it's too extreme for most people, but these are cognitive load decisions. You're choosing to lower cognitive load because you create more energy for focus and attention, besides the keen fashion statement.
And it's just a waste of damn time to worry about that stuff, right? Talk about intrinsic motivation and how that's sort of an underlying force and how your employees perform. Talk about that a little bit.
So when you're talking about peak performance, flow is necessary but not sufficient. When you look at the full peak performance toolkit, there are a series of motivation skill sets. There are a series of creativity skill sets. There are a series of learning skill sets. And there are a series of flow skill sets. But the conversation always starts with motivation, because that's where our biology is designed to start. And the research is really clear. It says that if you're interested in producing more motivation in yourself or your employees, you got to start with extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is the stuff that's outside of us. Money, sex, fame, those are external motivators. But it's a funny thing, right? We want, from if you're trying to derive productivity and performance in yourself or in your workforce, you need to pay people enough that their basic safety and security needs are met, and they have a little left over for discretionary. After that, it's not that we stop wanting more salaries. Of course, we want more salary. But if you really are interested in motivating performance from that point on, you actually have to start offering intrinsic motivators. There's in household income. This is Daniel Kahneman's work, the Nobel laureate. At $75,000 a year, there's a divergence between happiness and income. So if a household can make $75,000 a year, mom, dad, kid, right? $75,000 a year, that's basic needs plus a little left over for discretionary. After that, if you want to motivate employees or motivate yourself, intrinsic motivators, internal motivators. The research shows there are 5, and they are designed to come online in a specific sequence. Motivation starts, we talked about it, with curiosity.
Right.
A little bit of dopamine, a little bit of norepinephrine. Curiosity is biologically designed to be built into passion. What we call passion is essentially the intersection of 3 or 4 or 5 of our curiosities where they come together. And after you play there and get some like little wins, public successes, stuff that starts generating more pleasure neurochemistry, that's the cocktail of passion. Passion, by the way, is a shitload of dopamine and a shitload of norepinephrine, right? It's curiosity turned way up. The next motivator we want after passion comes online is purpose, and it's designed to go in this sequence. And purpose is literally our passion attached to something that's outside of ourselves, right? So, and this sounds really altruistic, and I know Gen Z and the millennials love running around and talking about their purpose and their mission, and maybe that's truly altruistic, and that's great, but from a biological peak performance standpoint, it's really selfish. When you have purpose, you get all that norepinephrine and dopamine from passion, and then you get all the pro-social reward chemicals, oxytocin and endorphins and anandamide and serotonin, and it's way more pleasure drugs. So purpose may sound all lofty, but it makes you more high. And by the way, how do we know this even in flow science? So the most persistent flow high on the earth, most flow states will last about 90 minutes. Alan Lukes, who founded Big Brother, Big Sister, found that altruism will produce a flow state known as helper's high that can last a day, sometimes two. That's the power of pro-social neurochemistry, right? So once you have purpose, what do you need? Autonomy. The freedom to pursue your purpose. And once you have that, what do you want? Mastery, the skills to pursue it well. So there's a big 5 intrinsic motivators: curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, mastery. And they're designed to come online in that order. And all of them are really important with employees. But, autonomy is the cool one that I like to talk about the most, because you have to start asking questions like, well, okay, autonomy. My employees need autonomy. How much autonomy do they actually need, right? And here we don't have research, but we've got case studies. Google's 20% time is Google going after this same motivator, right? It's, my employees want autonomy, right? And it works. 50% of Google's highest revenue projects were created in 20% time. They didn't come up with the idea. 3M came up with the idea. They had 15% time dating back to the 60s, and it accounts for billions of dollars a year in 3M revenue. But it turns out you can go smaller than that. Patagonia, which is often topping lists of coolest place to work in America. And if you ask people, why do you love Patagonia? They tell you a couple of things. Mostly it's the autonomy to make your own schedule and to go surfing whenever you want. That's the 2 autonomies that Patagonia gives you. And those are a big deal from a peak performance standpoint for a couple of reasons. If you can make your own schedule, you can work in accordance with your circadian rhythms, which is usually important. You want your employees to be coming to work and doing their work when they are most awake and alert. 2, you can always get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. And peak performance, there's certain basics in peak performance, things you have to do just to produce enough energy to even get into flow or perform at your best. 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. And it's pretty much a non-negotiable. And for anybody in a business environment who wants to push back against this, cool. I hear you. I know you're cool. You're different. You're the entrepreneur. You can sleep 5 hours a night. And what I will tell you is take a cognitive test. There's a billion of them online. They're free. Find a cognitive performance test. Take it after 5 hours of sleep. Take it after 6 hours of sleep. Take one after 7 and 8, and see how you do. And you'll never have this discussion again out loud. The first time I did this, somebody did this to me, and I was like, no way. I went through grad school on 6 hours. What are you talking about? I lost 15 IQ points after 5 hours. I was like, oh wow, I'm so dumb. I'll never do this again. Most people learn that lesson. So scheduling allows employees to work when they're most alert and to always get enough sleep. And the performance benefits for an organization are huge. So the other thing that Patagonia has is Yvon Chouinard is a surfer. So he's got a house policy. Patagonia's corporate headquarters is in Oxnard, is in California on the Pacific. Yeah. Let my people go surfing, right? Famous policy. And it means that if there are waves breaking in the Pacific, doesn't matter what the hell you're doing at Patagonia, you can stop, you can leave the meeting, you can walk away from Yvon Chouinard, the founder, and go surfing. And there's two ideas here. One, for complicated reasons that we can go into or not, depending, anxiety blocks peak performance. We all know this. Well, there are the three best ways to lower anxiety are a daily gratitude practice, a daily mindfulness practice, or daily exercise. And we try to tell people you should always do one of the three every day because it literally lowers anxiety levels. And anxiety, norepinephrine, which is essentially anxiety, too much of it blocks flow. A little bit will help you get into flow, too much will totally block flow. And so exercise, the freedom to exercise, automatically you get all the exercise benefits, health, longevity, all that wellness, all that stuff. Plus, you tend to lower anxiety levels, which means more flow for the employees. And finally, surfing is packed with flow triggers. So this is something Patagonia knows that every other company should know, which is the most important thing you could do for flow is, if you want more flow in your life, is go find whatever is your highest flow activity. For people working at Patagonia, it's surfing. They're all outdoor athletes, but like we all have a high flow activity. It's whatever that thing you've done your entire life that drops you into flow. For me, it's skiing, right? Some people, my wife, it's hiking with dogs through nature or riding horses. You know what I mean? Everybody's got their thing. Some people's dancing to hip hop or parkour or building model airplanes, or take your pick, reading economics, whatever it is. There's a thing that you do that drops you into flow. That's your high flow or your primary flow activity. So the more flow you get, the more flow you get. It's a focusing skill. So if if Patagonia employees go surfing and get into flow, it means when they're at work 2 days later, their brain is going to have an easier time doing the same focusing skill. Also, the heightened creativity and the heightened mood produced by flow will outlast the flow state by a day, maybe two. Third, flow also resets the nervous system, actually better than exercise. When we move into flow, there's a global release of nitric oxide, which is a gaseous signaling molecule in every cell, basically in every cell in the body. And it gets released as we move into flow. So anybody who's ever worked out, when your lungs expand and you feel your lungs open up, that's nitric oxide. It does that, among other things. It's flushing stress hormones out of your system. That's what's happening. That's why you feel better, you're happier after your lungs open up. Why it's like 20 minutes into exercise, right? That's the front edge of a flow state, but the stress hormones are getting flushed out of your system. So what happens is, by allowing employees access to their primary flow activity, and if the surf is bad and it's just exercise, right, at least anxiety gets lowered. Surf is good and it's flowy, great, cool, because you're going to come back to work 500% more productive. Who the hell cares if you took 2 hours and went surf, right? Like the math on 500% more productive, just so everybody understands this, is if you spend an afternoon a week, like go to work on Monday and spend Monday in the flow state, you're going to get as much done as everybody else Monday through Friday, right? 2 days a week in flow, you're 1,000% more productive than the competition. And the final thing I think I want to say on this topic is, we train a lot of people at the Flow Research Collective, and a lot of other people are doing this work. Companies are doing this work. And if employees are learning to be 500% more productive more frequently, because we can now make flow reliable and repeatable, companies that are not doing this work, I believe, are going to have a really hard time keeping up moving forward, because a lot of companies, just like mindfulness, spread everywhere because the benefits were so extreme. Same thing with flow. And, I think equally critical working from home, or maybe more critical working from home, because a lot of the interpersonal flow we used to get from going to work is totally gone.
Yeah. Look, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that there's an enormous business case for it, right? I mean, it's not just the right thing. I mean, there's just the numbers don't lie. And I think if you look at sort of what's happening, you look at just the Fortune 500, right, where companies are disappearing. It used to be on the Fortune 500 list for 75 years or something?
67 years. I think that was from 1936. Average was 67 years, and today it's 14.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the last point. It's kind of worth making, since it's a business discussion. So I talk about this a lot in most of my books on technology. one of the problems we have keeping pace in an exponentially accelerating world when we have tech moving at exponential growth rates is we have local and linear brains. Our brains evolved in environments that were local, meaning everything was about a day's walk away, and linear, meaning like great-great-granddad's life was the same as his great-great-grandson's, right? Like the gap between fire and the wheel is like 15,000 years, right? And these are the two big inventions that follow it. This is what we evolved in. We live in an environment that's global and exponential, and the brain doesn't process information at the speed or the scale. Flow is the only time we do. Flow is the brain processing information at speed and at scale. That's one of the things that happens. We actually, even better, more research needs to be done on this. But there's been a bunch of work on time horizons and how do you plan for the future? How does your company plan for the future? Jane McDonald did some really interesting stuff. And some other people have worked on this. But most people have sort of like a 6-month built-in time horizon for most things because we evolved in an environment where all you had to do is figure out how do you survive the winter, the next season. You had to know what was coming, right? And most of us totally tap out after 10 years, completely can't see. But it's even weirder than that, right? If I ask you to imagine, like if I said, close your eyes and imagine who you're going to be in 5 years, the part of your brain that is you deactivates.
That just gave me a lot of anxiety, by the way.
So this is why people have trouble like signing up for prostate exams or staying on diets, because future you is literally not you. The medial prefrontal cortex gets active when we think about ourselves. It gets deactivated when we think about strangers. Total strangers, it's shut off, right? Loved one, it's a little active, guy on the bus is totally shut down. When I ask you to think about your future self 5 years out, it turns off. You think about your future self as a stranger, which is why you don't want to stay on a diet today, because the person who's going to benefit from the diet isn't you, right? This is, our genes are selfish, our brains are sort of selfish, and the present tense focused in a weird way. So for companies trying to plan into the future, we have built-in limitations. And flow allows us to think of speed and scale. And it's very useful in today's business environment for just that.
That's wow. This has been fun and enlightening, man. We've got to do this again. This has been really fascinating. And we didn't even get to the office and the new reality and how to make all that work better. But anyway, thank you so much for being on the show today, Steven.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And how can people? People can get it at Amazon and.
Yeah, you could. The Art of Impossible is the name of the book. You can get it in Amazon or anywhere you buy books. Please try to support your indies during COVID. If you can get a book from an indie, but Barnes and Noble, Amazon, they've got it also.
And you can also. I love the site, the Flow Research Collective.
If you want to hear more about the work we're doing and you're interested in training with us or anything like that, if you go to flowresearchcollective.com, anything you want is there. If you want more flow info, there's endless videos that are there for free, and you can hear much more blah, blah, blah from me.
All right. Well, you guys have a great day. Thank you for being with us here. You can go to Power Lunch Live to see what the schedule is in the coming weeks. And until tomorrow, we'll see you then. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.